There are weddings in history that seal alliances, that forge dynasties, that are remembered for their opulence and their promise. And then there is the wedding of the Emperor Nero. Imagine the scene in the heart of the Roman world, a formal ceremony, imbued with all the ancient rites and solemn traditions. The groom is the most powerful man on earth, the master of legions and continents, a figure considered a living god. But the bride is a phantom, clad in the costly silks and fine veils of an empress. Adorned with the famous jewels of the imperial house, there stands a figure of delicate, haunting beauty. The guests, the senators and nobles of Rome, offer their congratulations, their faces masks of strained politeness. They call the bride Empress and Sabina, but they know, everyone knows, beneath the veil, this is not a woman. This is not Poppaea Sabina, the Empress Nero had loved and lost. This is a boy, a youth named Sporus, mutilated and remade into a living effigy of the dead. This is not merely a story of an emperor's eccentricity, a footnote in the lurid tales of Roman decadence. To dismiss it as such is to miss the profound horror at its core. This is a chronicle of erasure. It is the story of how absolute power, fueled by a grief so monstrous it became a creative and destructive force, can systematically unmake a human being. We will venture beyond the shocking headlines of the ancient historians to understand the grim reality of what it meant to be Sporus. We will explore the psychological torment of a boy forced to become a ghost, to wear the identity of another like a funeral shroud. Who was the person who existed before the emperor's gaze fell upon him? What was endured inside the gilded cage of the Palatine Hill, where love was a form of possession and identity was a costume to be worn at the master's command? This is the story of Sporus, the castrated boy who became an empress, and his tragic, desperate fight to reclaim a self that had been stolen from him. Before the name Sporus became intertwined with imperial madness, he was simply a boy. History, in its grand and often callous sweep, does not record the details of his birth or his family. He was likely a pure delicatus, one of the beautiful young boys, often of freedman or slave status, who were kept in wealthy Roman households as cupbearers and personal attendants, prized for their aesthetic appeal. Or perhaps he was an orphan of the streets, his only asset the striking, almost ethereal beauty of his face. His name, Sporus, is a Greek name meaning seed or sowing, a cruel irony for a boy whose future will be defined by the very negation of that concept. In this anonymity lies his universality. He could have been anyone, any youth whose physical form pleased the wrong eye at the wrong time. His early life was a blank slate, but it was his own. He possessed a body that was whole, a future that was unwritten, and an identity, however humble, that belonged to him. This state of simple, unmolested being was his peak condition, an innocence that would soon be irrevocably shattered. His curse was not a flaw within him, but the very quality that made him noticeable, a face that held a ghostly echo of another. To understand the abyss into which Sporus was thrown, one must first understand the world that allowed it to happen. First-century Rome was a civilization of staggering contradictions. It was a world of profound legal and philosophical thought that coexisted with the most casual brutality. It was a society with rigid social hierarchies where the emperor's whim could override any law, any tradition, any life. The power of the paterfamilias, the head of a Roman household, was absolute over his children, his slaves, and his property, extending even to the power of life and death. The emperor was the paterfamilias of the entire Roman state, and his authority was, in practice, limitless. Sexuality, too, was viewed through the lens of power and status, not morality as we might understand it today. For a freeborn Roman man of the elite, sexual activity with social inferiors, be they slaves, prostitutes, or entertainers of either sex, was not only accepted but expected. The defining factor was not gender, but dominance. The penetrator was masculine and powerful. The penetrated, regardless of gender, was submissive and inferior. Sporus, as a youth of low status, was already vulnerable within this paradigm. He was an object before he ever became a specific obsession. This was the world ruled by Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. Nero, the last of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, was an emperor of profound complexities. He was a man of genuine artistic sensibility, trapped in the role of an autocrat. He fancied himself a poet, a musician, a charioteer, a god. But beneath the artistic veneer lay a deep-seated paranoia and a capacity for startling violence, stoked by a childhood spent navigating the lethal intrigues of the imperial court, particularly at the hands of his manipulative and powerful mother, Agrippina the Younger. By the time Sporus enters the historical record, Nero's reign had already descended into a perilous phase. He had arranged his mother's murder, divorced and executed his first wife Octavia, and increasingly surrounded himself with sycophants who catered to his every whim. Central to this period was his second wife, Poppaea Sabina. She was renowned for her extraordinary beauty and cunning ambition. Poppaea was the great love of Nero's life, a woman for whom he had cast aside his previous wife and defied senatorial opinion. Their relationship was passionate, tempestuous, and ultimately fatal. The turning point, the single event that sealed Sporus's fate, was the death of Poppaea in the year 65. The historian Suetonius reports a chillingly domestic and brutal end. In a fit of rage, supposedly because she had chided him for returning late from the races, the emperor, whose wife was pregnant at the time, delivered a single, violent kick. The blow was fatal. Whether an impulsive act of violence or a tragic accident, the result was the same. The empress was dead. Nero's reaction was not one of quiet grief. It was an extravagant, theatrical, and deeply pathological spectacle of mourning. He delivered the eulogy himself, praising her beauty and deifying her, declaring her goddess. He had her body embalmed with priceless spices rather than cremated in the Roman fashion, a tribute usually reserved for foreign kings. The entire state was commanded to mourn with him. But this public performance was not enough to quell the emperor's consuming, guilt-ridden obsession. His grief needed an object, a vessel, and so his gaze fell upon Sporus. The boy, we are told, bore an uncanny resemblance to the dead empress. In the distorted mind of the emperor, this was not a coincidence. It was a sign, a chance for a grotesque resurrection. The immediate ramification for Sporus was an act of unspeakable violence, a decision made with the cold authority of an emperor who saw a human body as mere clay to be remolded to his will. Nero ordered that Sporus be castrated. This was not a back-alley mutilation. This was an act of state carried out by imperial physicians. The procedure itself, in an age without anesthesia or modern surgical knowledge, would have been an agony of unimaginable proportions, a searing trauma for which the body might never fully recover. But the physical pain was perhaps secondary to the profound violation it represented. In a single brutal act, Sporus was stripped of his biological sex, his potential for a future family, and the very core of his masculine identity. He was rendered a permanent neuter, a blank canvas upon which the emperor could paint his fantasy. This was the point of no return. The boy who was Sporus ceased to exist, and a new, terrifying creation began to take his place. His initial response was, by necessity, one of survival. A boy of his station had no power to refuse an emperor. Compliance was the only path forward. And so began the horrifying process of transformation. Sporus was taken into the deepest chambers of the palace and subjected to a macabre re-education. He was no longer to be addressed as Sporus, but as Sabina. He was dressed in the lavish gowns and robes of the deceased empress. Her jewels were placed upon his body. He was taught to mimic her gestures, the cadence of her voice, the tilt of her head. He became a living doll, a puppet whose strings were held by a grieving, demented master. His life now depended on the perfection of his performance. Every day was a test. Any failure to embody the ghost of Poppaea, any flicker of the boy he used to be, could provoke the emperor's unpredictable and lethal wrath. He was adapting not to a new life, but to a living death, a state of perpetual performance where his own self was the enemy. The private madness soon became a grotesque public spectacle. The transformation of Sporus was not a secret shame hidden within the palace walls. Nero demanded that the world participate in his delusion. The emperor, who had mourned Poppaea with such public fanfare, now celebrated his new bride with equal ceremony. The culmination of this was a formal wedding. In one account, the ceremony took place in Rome, in another, during Nero's extended tour of Greece. The location is secondary to the act itself. Sporus was formally and legally married to the emperor. He was given a dowry, a ceremonial procession, and was veiled with the flammeum, the traditional flame-colored veil of a Roman bride. The Roman elite were forced to attend, to offer their blessings, to acknowledge Sporus, this mutilated boy, as their empress. The historian Cassius Dio records a grimly witty remark from one attendee who supposedly said, "It would have been well for the world if Nero's father had had such a wife." The joke was a whisper of defiance in a hurricane of enforced insanity. The pressure on Sporus was amplified by the ecosystem of sycophancy that surrounded the emperor. Figures like the notoriously cruel Praetorian prefect, Ophonius Tigellinus, were not just passive observers. They were active enablers of Nero's escalating fantasies. Their power and position depended on validating the emperor's reality, no matter how detached from the truth it became. They would have been the first to address Sporus as Domina or Augusta, to compliment her beauty, to treat the living doll as a real empress. This created an environment of total gaslighting. Everywhere Sporus turned, his stolen identity was reinforced. The entire imperial court became a stage, and all its members were actors in Nero's bizarre play. This external pressure would have worked to systematically dismantle Sporus's own sense of self. When everyone around you insists you are someone else, how long can you hold on to the truth of who you are? This forced transformation utterly isolated Sporus. He was a creature of paradox, inhabiting a lonely space between all recognized categories of being. He was not a man, for his masculinity had been carved from him. He was not a woman, for that was a biological impossibility. He was not truly an empress, for his title was a farce. He was an imperial possession, the most prized object in Nero's collection. His relationships were dictated by his role. Nero showered Sabina with the affection and kisses one would give a wife, a public performance of love that was, in reality, an act of supreme psychological ownership. For others in the court, any interaction would have been fraught with peril. To treat him as the boy he was would be treason. To treat him as the empress he was not was to participate in a lie. He was surrounded by thousands in the bustling life of the court and the city, but he was fundamentally, terrifyingly alone, trapped within a performance he could never be allowed to abandon. The Grand Tour of Greece, from late 66 to early 68, represented a key period of this sustained suffering. Nero traveled not as a conquering general, but as a performing artist, competing in the Olympic and other Panhellenic Games in events of music, poetry, and chariot racing. And at his side, for all the world to see, was his empress, Sabina. Sporus was paraded through the ancient cities of Greece, a living testament to the emperor's power to bend reality itself. He would have been present at the lavish banquets, the award ceremonies where a fawning and intimidated jury invariably declared Nero the victor. This journey was a prolonged public humiliation, a constant reinforcement of his false identity on an international stage. The situation was made even more confusing and perverse by Nero's other relationship at the time. The emperor also famously married a man named Pythagoras, a freedman. In that relationship, however, Nero played the role of the bride, wearing the veil and submitting to his husband for Sporus. This must have been a mind-bending tableau of inverted identities and fluid roles, a world where gender and status were nothing more than costumes to be put on and taken off at the whim of one all-powerful, unstable man. The apex of the crisis for Sporus was inextricably linked to the collapse of his master's regime. By the year 68, The Roman world had tired of its theatrical emperor. The governor of Gallia Lugdunensis, Vindex, rose in revolt, followed by Galba in Spain. The carefully constructed world of art and delusion that Nero had built around himself began to crumble. The Senate, sensing the shift in power, finally summoned the courage to act. They declared Nero a public enemy, sentencing him to death by flogging. The golden cage of the palace was no longer a sanctuary. It was a trap. The god emperor was suddenly a fugitive, his divine authority evaporating into fear and chaos. For Sporus, this was a moment of supreme terror. His entire existence, his safety, his very life, was contingent on Nero's power. As his owner's world fell apart, what would become of him? He was not a wife who might be granted a widow's dignity. He was a piece of contraband, living evidence of the fallen emperor's most notorious perversions. In the final, desperate hours of Nero's life, Sporus was there. He was one of the very few who did not abandon the emperor, accompanying him in his ignominious flight from Rome to a freedman's villa in the suburbs. We can only imagine the state of Sporus's mind, the sheer panic of a boy caught in the downfall of a titan. He was a witness to the pathetic end of the man who had remade him. Nero, the artist, the god, was now a terrified man, weeping and vacillating, unable to take his own life. He lamented his fate, famously crying, "Qualis artifex perio? What an artist dies in me." He commanded others to kill themselves first to show him how it was done. Finally, with the sound of approaching horsemen, he forced his loyal secretary, Epaphroditus, to guide his hand in plunging a dagger into his own throat. The man who had destroyed Sporus's life and identity died not with a roar, but with a pathetic, self-pitying whimper, his final thoughts on his lost artistry, not the human wreckage he left in his wake. With Nero's death, the immediate crisis of his ownership was resolved, but Sporus's ordeal was far from over. It simply entered a new, more dangerous phase. He had ceased to be the possession of a single man and became a political symbol, a spoil of war to be claimed by the victors. He was immediately taken in by Nymphidius Sabinus, the ambitious Praetorian prefect who had betrayed Nero and now hoped to seize the throne for himself. Nymphidius, in a bid to connect himself to the fallen imperial line, also took Sporus as his wife, calling him Poppaea and treating him as a legacy he had inherited. Sporus was passed from one master to the next, his identity as a living ghost now a transferable asset. But Nymphidius's ambitions were short-lived. He was killed by his own Praetorian guards. Sporus's fate was once again in flux. He then fell into the hands of Otho, who became emperor in January of 69. In a poignant and twisted turn of events, Otho had been the first husband of the real Poppaea Sabina, before Nero had forced him to divorce her. He too showed affection for Sporus, perhaps seeing in the boy's face a genuine and painful reminder of the woman he had lost. For Sporus, this must have been a relentless torment, forever being treated as the shadow of a woman he never knew, his own personhood completely invisible to his successive keepers. The brief and bloody reign of Otho ended at the Battle of Bedriacum. The new master of Rome was Aulus Vitellius, an emperor known to history primarily for his gluttony and his cruelty. For Vitellius, Sporus was not a symbol of lost love or imperial legacy. He was an object for debased entertainment. Vitellius conceived of a plan of ultimate degradation. He intended to use Sporus in a public spectacle, a morbid piece of theater for the amusement of the Roman mob. Sporus was to be cast in a gladiatorial show, not as a fighter, but as a victim. He was to play the lead role in a fatal reenactment of the ancient myth of the rape of Proserpina, where the goddess is abducted and taken to the underworld. This meant that Sporus would be publicly and violently assaulted before being killed as part of the performance. It was the final, most horrifying humiliation imaginable, to have his trauma, his identity, and his body turned into a blood sport, his suffering made into a public holiday. Faced with this unbearable future, Sporus made a choice. For the first time since he was a young boy, he seized control of his own destiny. He would not be paraded, assaulted, and killed for the pleasure of a crowd. He would not allow his final moments to be a spectacle of another man's design. Before Vitellius's monstrous plan could be realized, Sporus took his own life. The historical sources do not record the method, only the act. It was a final, desperate assertion of agency. In an existence defined by the whims of others, his death was his own. There would be no state funeral, no public eulogy. The body of the boy who had been an empress was likely disposed of with the anonymity befitting his actual status in Roman society, a nobody. His end was as quiet and private as his life had been noisily and grotesquely public. In death, he finally escaped the role he had been forced to play. The suicide of a former imperial favorite had no discernible impact on the political landscape of Rome. The year of the 4 emperors raged on, and the empire was consumed with civil war, not the fate of a castrated boy. His death was a footnote to a footnote, a testament to how utterly he, as a person, did not matter. He was a symptom of Nero's sickness, not a cause of anything that followed. His life and death were personal tragedies, not political events. He was simply swept away by the tide of history, a piece of human flotsam in the wake of a fallen emperor. Ancient historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio recounted his story with a tone of morbid curiosity. To them, Sporus was primarily a piece of evidence, Exhibit A in the case against Nero's monstrous depravity. He was a symbol of how far an emperor had fallen from Roman ideals of masculinity and dignity. The boy himself, his suffering, and his inner world were of little interest. He was a bizarre prop in the drama of a tyrant's downfall. It is only with a modern sensibility, one more attuned to the concepts of psychological trauma, abuse, and identity, that we can look back and see Sporus not as a curiosity, but as a victim of profound and systematic human cruelty. The debate is not over the facts of his life, which are grimly attested, but over our own perspective. Do we see a freak of history, or do we see a child who was destroyed? The story of Sporus serves as a chilling lesson on the nature of absolute power. It demonstrates that the ultimate power is not merely the authority to kill, but the authority to unmake. Nero did not just command Sporus. He deconstructed him, stripping away his name, his gender, his past, and his future, and replacing them with a fantasy. It is a terrifying illustration of how one person's identity can be consumed and erased by another's obsession. Sporus was forced to live as a lie, his existence a constant performance under the threat of death. His tragedy underscores the profound human need for a stable sense of self and the horror of having that anchor violently ripped away. In the end, what is the legacy of Sporus? He is a ghost at the lavish, bloody feast of Roman history. He is a silent, haunting reminder of the unrecorded suffering that underpinned the grandeur of the empire. For every senator whose name we know, for every general whose victories we celebrate, there were countless individuals like Sporus whose lives were considered disposable, whose bodies were mere instruments for the pleasure or power of others. He symbolizes the ultimate victimhood, the complete annihilation of the self at the hands of unchecked authority. He is a cautionary tale written in scars, a story not of marble and monuments, but of flesh and pain. Let us return for a final moment to the image of that wedding. A public ceremony where a boy was forced into the role of a dead empress, his identity sacrificed for an emperor's grief. Contrast that with the final act of his life, a private death, chosen in a moment of desperate clarity. He was compelled to live as a public fiction, a role he perfected for survival. But he chose to die as a private truth. His suicide was not the final degradation. It was a tragic, bloody, and defiant reclamation. It was the last and only act of Sporus, the boy, refusing to perform any longer as Sabina, the empress. In that final, solitary moment, he shed the costume that had been forced upon him and, in the only way he had left, took back his name.